For those who may have wondered if Klint Kubiak was going to be looking for a different quarterback, he may have silenced those ideas in his opening press conference. I'm going to be taking a deep dive into all the key takeaways from Klint Kubiak's introduction to local media here in Seattle, coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in, and thank you as always for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Whether you're tuning in from Joyce, Washington, or Sundance, Wyoming, we greatly appreciate each and every one of you. Klint Kubiak, introduced today as the new offensive coordinator for the Seattle Seahawks, spoke with media alongside head coach Mike McDonald. I'm going to be taking a deep dive into several of the key takeaways that I took from today's press conference, plus going to wrap up our 2024 final grade reports with Seattle's edge rushing group, the last position, saving the best for last, breaking that down. Everybody from Boye Mafe to Draymond Jones. That'll be coming up courtesy of FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. A few weeks after officially being announced as the Seahawks' new offensive coordinator, Klint Kubiak was introduced to local media at the VMAC today, had an opportunity to field questions on a number of different topics, including the quarterback situation, what he looks for along the offensive line, and much more. There was one thing that really jumped out immediately, though. And look, this has been a talking point all offseason so far, even before Klint Kubiak was hired by the Seattle Seahawks as Ryan Grubb's replacement. What is going to happen with Geno Smith moving into the final year of his contract? Is he going to play out that deal with a $44.5 million cap hit? That seems unlikely. Is he going to be traded? Could he be cut? Is he going to get an extension, which still seems to me like the most likely possibility in terms of what's going to happen next with Geno Smith? But for those that were wondering if Kubiak may want to go a different direction at the quarterback position, he had this to say when I asked him about comparing Geno Smith with Kirk Cousins, a quarterback that he had a lot of success with in Minnesota from 2019 to 2021. Take a listen.
Two excellent players, and I think Geno is his own man in a great way. Like, Geno is a very aggressive player, have a lot of production. Obviously, he's been doing it for a long time. He's overcome a lot in his career. I have a lot of respect for Geno. Was a huge draw to come here and be able to get to coach him, alongside Andrew Janocko. So we have high expectations for him. We're going to push Geno and get the best out of him, and we'll do that by pushing his teammates as well. It's not just his show. It's a team thing, and he's got to be the head of that.
Some fans might hear the things that Klint Kubiak just said and think that it's lip service. But as we've talked about really since Kubiak was even mentioned as a candidate to replace Ryan Grubb, if you look at his track record as a quarterback coach and an offensive coordinator and a pass game specialist a couple years ago in San Francisco, regardless of the roles that he has held, he has had success with veteran quarterbacks. He's had success with younger quarterbacks. He kind of had to deal with both of those situations last year in New Orleans with Derick Hall and Spencer Rattler. The injuries that hit that Saints team weren't exempt from the quarterback spot. But if you look at the areas where his quarterbacks have been successful, Kirk Cousins was consistently among league leaders in yards per attempt. They took their shots downfield. They generated yards after the catch. So it was a combination of those two things. Was consistently one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the league. He finished in the top 10 in passing touchdowns each of the 3 years that he worked with Klint Kubiak. And he also had 2 years where he had one of the lowest interception rates. Now, some may say, well, Geno Smith doesn't check that box off, but that might not necessarily just be Geno Smith. There have been other factors. He's had a worse offensive line than Kirk Cousins had during his time in Minnesota. And the scheme certainly helps when you're playing more under center. Maybe not as much play action as you would anticipate, but sprinkling in more two-back sets, different things of that nature to help your quarterback and take a little bit of pressure off of his shoulders. Geno Smith does a lot of the things at a really high level that Klint Kubiak wants from his quarterbacks. 2 years ago, when he was the pass game coordinator in San Francisco, Brock Purdy led the league in yards per attempt, and he was in the top 5 in yards, passing touchdowns. This is a quarterback in Geno Smith that can check off those boxes. He is a player that absolutely can complete passes with the best of them in terms of accuracy. He is an outstanding deep ball thrower. He has been the most efficient deep ball passer in the NFL over the last 3 seasons. According to Pro Football Focus, 79 big-time throws that traveled 20-plus yards. No quarterback had more in the last 3 seasons. So when you consider all of those aspects and the fact that Geno Smith is a comfortable pocket passer, he likes to work from under center, he likes to run play action, and he's really a decisive decision maker most of the time. We saw last year in the red zone, obviously, that was not the case. There were some issues there on that front, but he's generally been a good decision maker. He checks off the boxes that Klint Kubiak is looking for at the quarterback position. So I was not surprised at all. In fact, this is the type of reaction I would have expected. And again, I get it. There's going to be some fans that say, well, what's he supposed to say? He's not going to badmouth Geno Smith at a press conference, but listen to Klint Kubiak today, and just knowing what I know about him heading into this press conference, he's not a guy that's rah-rah. He's not overly charismatic. This is not a guy that I think is going to go out of his way to try to sugarcoat things. That is just not his personality. And I do think that Geno Smith offers a lot of the physical traits and the toughness that Klint Kubiak is looking for from his quarterbacks. And he has a history of working with QBs who excel late in games. Kirk Cousins has always been really good in the fourth quarter. He's engineered a lot of game-winning drives. Geno Smith has more game-winning drives and fourth quarter comebacks combined over the last 2 seasons than any quarterback in the NFL. He's tied with Patrick Mahomes for game-winning drives. He's ahead in a group by himself in comebacks orchestrated in the fourth quarter the last couple of seasons. So that particular aspect of his DNA and the fact that Kubiak, he is a passionate football lifer. He has followed Geno Smith's story. He knows what he has overcome as the quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks. And to get to the point where he was able to be a comeback player of the year and a 2-time Pro Bowler, got the Seahawks to the playoffs his first year as a starter. Obviously, he's been far from perfect, but this becomes a situation where Klint Kubiak, he is inheriting a strong veteran quarterback that does a lot of the things that he is looking for. This has not been a coordinator that necessarily has had the dual threat QBs that he's been trying to work with. He has had pocket passers who make sound decisions, get the football out of their hands, accurate, can get the ball downfield and take those chunk plays. Geno Smith fits the bill in all those areas, at least in the short term. And so, again, I was not surprised at all by this major vote of confidence from Klint Kubiak, and it fits with what Mike Macdonald has said recently in a couple of interviews where Geno's our quarterback. That was the decision I think that absolutely was made in this interview process. I think Klint Kubiak was genuinely very excited for the chance to be able to work with Geno Smith in Seattle. He's got Andrew Janocko, who has been his quarterback coach in New Orleans. They work together in Minnesota as well. So he's got that familiarity on the staff. Both those guys are really fired up for this chance to work with a quarterback who already has a really good foundation, obviously being the veteran quarterback that Geno Smith is, but it feels like there's still untapped upside there. And that if you can give him a little better support, if the run game is better, if you're able to scheme up your players better, like DK Metcalf, that you can get more out of Geno Smith. And so I think for Klint Kubiak, he's viewing this as a great challenge, an opportunity to work with a QB that's already good. Can I get him to that next level, at least back to where he was playing in 2022, and maybe better? If Klint Kubiak can accomplish that, this Seattle Seahawks team could be very dangerous next year. Again, a lot of could-be's in that statement. But the Seahawks are hoping that Kubiak and Geno Smith can have the type of success that Kubiak had with Kirk Cousins those 3 years they were together in Minnesota. What he did with Brock Purdy as a pass game coordinator, he was heavily involved in that success 2 years ago. We saw Brock Purdy take a step back this year. Injuries were part of it to his skill players, but still, they missed Klint Kubiak as the pass game coordinator. The Seahawks are hoping that they can get some of that magic from Kubiak, working with Geno Smith, and that can get them over the hump where they are not just competing for division championships, but they can do damage in the postseason next year as well. There's a lot of moving parts, but this was the vote of confidence that people have been waiting for. You've gotten it from Mike Macdonald. Now you've gotten it from Klint Kubiak, who seems genuinely excited for this chance to be able to work with Geno Smith. So I'm looking forward to see how this partnership works out. There's a lot of reason to think that this is going to be a successful partnership. Of course, the offensive line's got to be addressed. But to me, this is the first thing foremost that jumped out from today's press conference very clearly, that Klint Kubiak is on the pro Geno Smith side, and he is excited for this opportunity to work with the quarterback. We'll see what happens as they start diving into the scheme and they get it on the field eventually in April. But this is going to be a really interesting tandem to watch, to see how this progresses and how these two develop together as coach and quarterback. Up next, I'm going to be diving into some other key takeaways. It was more than just quarterbacks today. Going to be talking about Klint Kubiak's statements on a certain position that few teams are using that the Seahawks plan to unveil next year as part of their offense, a look at the run game scheme, and much more. That'll be coming up next year on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Football season may be over, but basketball is in full swing, and there's no better way to stay in the game than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you just pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. This week, I'm looking at Jason Tatum to score more than 29 points. The best part, PrizePicks is quick and easy. You can set up your lineup in less than 60 seconds, and their fast, secure withdrawals mean I get my winnings in as little as 15 minutes. Plus, I love their weekly promos like Taco Tuesday, where you get discounted player projections for even better value. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's the code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, riding solo for today's episode. Unfortunately, my co-host in crime, Rob Harang, had something come up, but we will have Rob for 2 other episodes coming up later this week. As always, a special thanks to all the 12s for tuning in, and thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Klint Kubiak meeting with local media here in Seattle for the first time today, alongside head coach Mike Macdonald. That was not something that I had seen previously, where the head coach actually met with the media the first time that the offensive coordinator did. But it was a great opportunity for Mike Macdonald to discuss how that process played out. And he was very thorough, just as he said he was going to be. They wanted to have a chance to interview a number of candidates and see what was out there, the different ideologies. And ultimately, Klint Kubiak just checked off the boxes that he was looking for. Somebody that had that shared vision that it didn't appear that he and Ryan Grubb ultimately had, and that's why Grubb is no longer on the staff. But that shared vision of physicality and what they want this football team to be, the toughness, having a run game, being able to take their shot plays, a turnover-centric defense, just that shared vision for what they wanted this football team to be. Now, there were a lot of things that jumped out to me from this press conference. And again, anytime that you're talking about press conferences with new coaches, this is not going to dictate how many games the Seahawks win next fall. You don't win games in press conferences. At the same time, you want to look for certain characteristics or certain things that jump out about the offense when you're talking about an offensive coordinator. And of course, for me, aside from the quarterback thing, the thing that really got my antennas perked up, this has been a league that fullbacks have basically become extinct for most teams. There are very few teams that actually have traditional fullbacks. If you need a second back in the backfield, well, let's just move a tight end or let's move a defensive tackle to that position. Very few teams in the league actually hold a roster spot for an actual fullback. It's a position that has become devalued, and a lot of teams just don't have it. But Klint Kubiak today made it very clear, and this shouldn't be surprising based on his track record, made it very clear the Seahawks are going to be bringing back the fullback. And really, Seattle has not used the fullback as part of their offense for more than a handful of plays since 2014. That was the last season that Michael Robinson was on the roster. And before that, you had Leonard Weaver, Max Strong. There is a history of great fullback play in Seattle. But like a lot of the rest of the league, this has really been an offense with the last several coordinators where there's been a lot of focus on 11 and 12 personnel groupings, not getting that second back in. Last year, the Seahawks only had 12 plays with 2 backs in the backfield. That is not something that was a big part of Ryan Grubb's offense. It's just something the Seahawks have not done. But I am fired up to hear that Klint Kubiak is planning to change that this year, because if you look at some of the teams that have had a lot of success in the National Football League in recent seasons, teams that are using fullbacks still have had a lot of success. If you look at Baltimore, San Francisco on their way to the Super Bowl a couple years ago, 2019 when he went to the Super Bowl, Kyle Juszczyk has been a big part of that. The few teams that are using fullbacks extensively, it isn't guaranteed that it's going to get you to the playoffs, but teams are having success doing this still. It is not something that went out of style because it isn't effective. Teams just like to throw the football around. They like to spread it out. Fullbacks are not part of that. And if you look at last season alone, there were only 4 teams that played fullbacks 25% or more of their offensive snaps. One of those teams was the New Orleans Saints with Klint Kubiak, and he had Adam Prentice playing the fullback position 25% of the time for his offense. So 1 out of every 4 plays, that's a much higher percentage than what we've seen in Seattle the last 10 years. Alec Ingold with the Dolphins, Patrick Ricard of the Ravens, and Kyle Juszczyk with the 49ers are the only other players that had a higher snap percentage at the fullback position for any teams in the NFL last year. So again, this is not lip service. This is what Klint Kubiak has done as a play caller in the National Football League, and it shouldn't come as a surprise. He heralds from the Mike Shanahan system that was championed by Gary Kubiak, his father, the Super Bowl winning coach. They use 2 back sets extensively. They use 2 tight end or 3 tight end sets extensively. This is a much more old school pro style system that is emphasizing the zone run game, emphasizing getting that extra blocker in there when able to. And if you look back at 2021, when Kubiak was the Vikings offensive coordinator, CJ Ham played more than 32% of Minnesota's snaps. So a third of the plays, they had a fullback out there. So there's a track record here. This is not somebody that is just spouting nonsense about playing a fullback and then it's going to turn around in August and September and not do it. Klint Kubiak is going to play a fullback. That is going to be part of it. Now, does that mean he's going to in-house get a player and maybe Brady Russell becomes your fullback or Derick Young becomes your fullback? He played the position a few snaps a couple of years ago. Does it mean he goes out and signs Patrick Ricard or Adam Prentice, who are both free agents, interestingly enough? Or do you draft a guy? There's some interesting players in the draft that could potentially be fullback options for the Seattle Seahawks. But that was clearly one of the big moments for me in this press conference, is the reiteration that we are going to bring back the fullback. It's going to be part of our physical identity. It's going to get our run game going. We are going to have that second back out there, whether it's a free agent, a draft pick, or somebody in-house. They are going to be attacking that here in coming weeks, personnel-wise, and looking at what they need to do to get that fullback on the field. Second thing that jumped out to me, aside from the quarterback talk with Geno Smith, there's been so much discussion about the offensive line, and rightfully so. It was still a major problem for the Seahawks last year, both in pass protection and in run blocking. You've got major questions at guard, maybe center, tackle. Both Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas going into the final year of their rookie deals. Are those 2 guys your long-term answers? There's a lot of questions at the offensive line group for the Seahawks. And I asked Klint Kubiak what he was looking for from his offensive lineman. He made it very clear that he wants smart, tough, and dependable players. And so there's some guys that have had injury issues in this offensive line. He wants guys that can stay healthy. He's looking for that toughness, guys that are going to be able to play consistently and be available. And what's between the ears is what he's going to value. That and the ability to have the agility to go and make the blocks that you need to. Those are going to be big components in this offense. But the other thing that I found interesting, yes, he made it clear we have a certain way that we want to do things, and that's build around that wide zone attack. But that doesn't mean that they are not going to play to their personnel. They're going to have pin and pulls. They are going to have counters. They are going to have power plays. They are going to have gap plays, especially if this unit, this offensive line that played better with gap-oriented schemes late in the season last year, if he looks at his personnel and says, look, this is what we are best at right now, we can improve upon our zone game, but the gap game's got to be a bigger part than it was in New Orleans, where they ran zone more than 74% of the time last year. If the personnel dictates that, Klint Kubiak made it very clear, look, we're going to do what our players do best, and we're going to adapt our system to that. And so look, this has been a coach consistently ran the zone blocking scheme. He's coming from that Mike Shanahan system that his father, Gary Kubiak, further adapted. He is going to want to run those zone concepts. But I think that Kubiak is the type of football mind that understands, hey, if I've got guys that are more maulers or they're good in the pulling schemes, he is going to mix more of those in maybe than what he did in New Orleans. And so certainly that was something that I thought was an exciting development to talk about. And last but not least, this wasn't something that was said specifically in the press conference, but it was announced right before Klint Kubiak and Mike Macdonald took the stage. There's all the talk about the new coaches that are coming in. John Benton, Klint Kubiak was raving about, and he should be. The guy's been in the league 20 plus years as offensive line coach. He's had a ton of success in the league. He's going to bring accountability to an offensive line that absolutely needs that type of a presence that is coaching them in that position group. Andrew Janocko at the quarterback spot. He's coach receivers. He's coach offensive line. He's got that all-encompassing viewpoint that Kubiak thinks is going to be a major asset, coaching up Geno Smith and Sam Howell this year at the quarterback spot. But a few of the guys that are being retained on this staff, Kennedy Palomalu, the running back coach, being the most notable to me. Palomalu actually coached in Minnesota with Klint Kubiak. So there's already that relationship that has been built in there, that those two are going to be working together. And I've said this several times in the podcast. I think Kennedy Palomalu is as good of a running back coach as there is in the National Football League. He's had multiple rushing title winners that he has coached. He's coached in zone-centric schemes. He has coached in gap-centric schemes. The guy just knows how to coach running backs. And the fact that he already had that built-in relationship with Kubiak, it shouldn't be a surprise that they are keeping him along for the ride. Their tight end coach, Mac Brown, also going to be retained. I thought that the tight ends played fairly solid last year for the most part, even with some of the injuries they were dealing with. Mac Brown's a guy that comes previously from the Jets. His background, he's a guy that they feel like can fit in well with Klint Kubiak's system. So I'm excited to see what happens on that front. But all these coaching staff moves that were made, Jake Peetz is the other one that I would mention as well, staying on as the passing game coordinator. Peetz actually coached for the Rams before he came to Seattle, so he was with Sean McVay. McVay stemming from the Shanahan system. He worked under Mike Shanahan. In Washington, he coached alongside Kyle Shanahan. So you've got those familiarities in terms of the schemes. Keeping those three coaches with some of the newcomers that have been brought on board, like John Benton, I think that they are doing a really good job of balancing, bringing in some new voices that understand the scheme and keeping some continuity on staff with guys that were here last year. So I think the Seahawks are doing this the right way. You didn't want to just scrap your entire offensive coaching staff unless you absolutely had to. Keep some of those voices in. Some of these guys have those prior connections already. So I think that they are doing a really good job of putting this staff together on the offensive side of the football. And maybe there's a few more moves coming, as McDonald hinted at. But it sounds like they are going to have a blend, almost a 50-50 blend of bringing back some guys that were here last year and the newcomers on the offensive line, the quarterback coach front to go with Klint Kubiak. And I think that's the best way to move forward for this football team. And I'm really excited to see what this coaching staff ultimately does and accomplishes together for the Seahawks in 2025. When we come back, I'm going to switch gears. We're going to our final report card segment of the 2024 season, looking at Seattle's edge rushing group. How did they perform compared to expectations? I'll be getting that up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends over at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on fourth quarter comebacks, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether I'm backing my team for a late-game rally or picking a player like Jimmy Butler to hit a clutch three. I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks, here live from the VMAC. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in, and thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We have reached the finish line in our annual end-of-season report card segment. We've covered all the offensive positional groups. We've got one position group left to cover on defense, and that is the edge rushing group. And I'll admit that this was a group going into the season, in terms of expectations, I wasn't necessarily sure what to think of this group, because on one hand, you had Geno Smith coming back from an injury. He had that great 2022 season. There was a lot of optimism that he could get back to playing to that level, returning to health. Draymond Jones, it was uncertain how he was going to fit into Mike McDonald's defense. Derick Hall had a really quiet rookie season. Boy Mafe, on the other hand, his sophomore season in 2023, nearly got to double-digit sacks. So this was a group where it was really hard to gauge just how good that they could be going into this season. And I think when you look at the production at the end of the year, really that final grade is going to reflect that for me. I'm going with a B- because I think that this group overall was better than average, but I'm not going to say that they were good or great. And there's still some major question marks here. Some of them being unfortunate, whether it's, Geno Smith missing a bunch of games again, missing 11 games total with a couple of injuries. The knee sprain, that was a dirty block by Wyatt Teller of the Cleveland Browns in the preseason. It's unfortunate that that happened, but you add into that and the quad tear that cost Geno Smith a handful of games in the second part of the season, his health. We got to see him play well at the end of the season, but really it's an incomplete grade for me with him because we only got to see him on the field for 5.5 games this season. He was very limited by the injuries. Draymond Jones, you get 4 sacks from him, less than he had the season prior. And even though he had 13 quarterback hits, you're just not seeing enough of the impact plays for a guy who's making $17 million per year on the contract Seattle gave him a couple years ago in free agency. Jones, to me, is a perfect example of a C player right now. You're getting enough contributions where you can look at him as being a average starter, but that's not what the Seahawks are paying him to be. They are paying him to be a disruptive game wrecker. And while there have been spurts where he has been that player, we saw it in Atlanta this year, for example, he has not been consistent near enough in terms of getting after the quarterback, creating the backfield. There's just too many games where he goes into ghost mode. And so for that reason, it's a C for me on him. Derick Hall, I'm giving a B+. He had a fantastic season, 8 sacks after having 0 his rookie year. That was really the major bright spot for me, was seeing Derick Hall. Late in the season, seemed like that he kind of was running on fumes a little bit because he played a lot more snaps this year than he did his rookie season. Didn't have much production in the pass rushing department the last 4 or 5 games, but still finished the year with 20 quarterback hits, 8 sacks. You saw the motor. Oh, by the way, returned a fumble for a touchdown as well in that win over the Falcons in Atlanta. There's a lot of reason to be excited about the development of Derick Hall. So I'm giving him a rock solid B+. And then the other major player in this edge group that played significant snaps, Boye Mafe. You look at the numbers and you don't see the impact that he had his sophomore season. He had 3 less sacks than he had the year before. His quarterback hits were down. And yet, when you watch the tape, especially the second half of the season, it seemed like he was a highly disruptive player. And he did a lot of things that maybe didn't show up on the stat sheet, or plays like swatted passes. Maybe the only guy that consistently is doing that for the Seahawks defensive line right now. He gets his big paws up there in the passing lane, knocks passes down. He plays with a high effort motor, play after play. Missed a few games early this season. I think that set him back a little bit, but overall it was still a decent season. I'm going to give him a B for his grade off the edge. I think when you look at this group as a whole, it's unfortunate that they weren't able to get very much from Trevis Gibson after they traded for him from Jacksonville. Played in 5 games, very few snaps in those 5 games, then was a healthy scratch and eventually landed on injured reserve. for an injury he suffered during practice. You didn't get much from him. Nwosu, the injuries obviously played a huge role. You didn't have much production from him in the games he did play. You started to see 2022 Uchenna Nwosu late in the season, but at that point, he had only played a couple of games. The injuries have been a major issue. So again, I'm going with a B- for this position group because I think that they're slightly better than average, but I wouldn't go as far as saying they are good or great at this point. Do I think this group can reach that level? If you have a healthy Uchenna Nwosu for most, if not the entire season, and Hall and Mafe take another solid step forward this year, then this has a chance to be a really good edge rush group. And if Draymond Jones is still around too, who knows what year two entails for him in Mike McDonald's scheme. I could see this being a potential strength for the Seahawks next year. And this is a good edge rushing draft class as well that you could add another piece or two if you wanted. So I feel like this is still a position group that has a really high ceiling, but we're not seeing them elevate up the ladder as quickly as hoped. And some of it's been misfortune with the injuries for Nwosu, but players like Draymond Jones maybe not quite living up to expectations. Boy, Mafe statistically going down a peg this year, even if on film he looks just as disruptive. There's some things that are keeping this group from really reaching their ceiling right now. For that reason, I think a B- is a perfect grade for this group looking back on the 2024 season. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, I'll be rejoined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And as we promised on today's episode, we're going to be taking a deep dive into what Ernest Jones' contract may look like, and the Seahawks are going to be able to pay that price to bring him back on a long-term extension. Make sure that you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.